Welcome, my dear listeners. I've created a wonderful story just for you. Before we begin the story, please write where in the world you're listening from. I read all the comments. If you're subscribed, the story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Death of the Chief Physician. London's foggy mornings brought with them a melancholy that permeated the city's soul. In November 1893, the faint light filtering through the window of 221B Baker Street bathed the two figures in the sitting room in an indistinct glow. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual chair, gazing out the window through the clouds of smoke rising from his pipe. Though his eyes seemed lost in the distance, his mind was ever alert. Dr. John Watson, leafing through the newspaper at the breakfast table, occasionally cast anxious glances at his friend. Holmes's quiet demeanour was either a sign of great distress or a harbinger of an approaching storm. "What occupies your mind at this early hour, Holmes?" Watson asked, raising his cup to his lips. Holmes replied without removing his pipe from his mouth. "The most dangerous moments for the human mind, Watson. Emptiness. Hours spent without occupation drive the brain to devour itself." Watson smiled slightly. "You're waiting for a case." "I'm not waiting," said Holmes without taking his eyes off the window. "I know it will come. On these gloomy days in London, darkness always finds a way." As if these words were a prophecy, the doorbell rang at that very moment. Footsteps hurried up the stairs, and a few seconds later Mrs. Hudson entered the room with a card in her hand. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Aldridge from Scotland Yard wishes to see you. He says it's quite urgent." Holmes's eyes lit up for the first time that morning. "Please let him in, Mrs. Hudson." Inspector George Aldridge was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and with a weary face. Years of experience showed in the lines on his face and the determination in his eyes. When he entered the room, he took off his hat and held it in his hand, with a respectful demeanour, as if entering a funeral home. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted them both. "I need your help. This morning, we received news from Blackthorn Mental Hospital." Holmes rose from his chair. Blackthorn, one of London's oldest and most prestigious mental health institutions. "Yes, sir. The chief physician, Dr. Edmund Halbrook, was found dead in his office this morning." Watson put down his newspaper. "From natural causes?" Aldridge shook his head. "I wish it were, Doctor. His throat was slit, a single cut, clean and deep." Holmes stood up, a familiar gleam in his eyes. "Tell me the details on the way, Inspector. Watson, get your coat. Blackthorn is waiting for us." The carriage made its way through London's crowded streets toward the northern part of the city. Blackthorn Mental Hospital stood in the middle of a large plot of land, far from the city's noise. The building, with its stately Victorian architecture and greyish bricks, cast a ghostly image in the misty morning. On the way, Inspector Aldridge relayed what he knew. Dr. Edmund Halbrook, 58 years old, had been Blackthorn's chief physician for 22 years, a respected medical man, one of the authorities on mental illness, married, no children. He had been found at 6 a.m. by a maid entering his office for the daily cleaning. "Was the door locked?" Holmes asked, his eyes scanning the outside through the carriage window. "No, Mr. Holmes. The door was closed but not locked." "The windows?" "All closed and bolted from the inside." Holmes nodded, but made no comment. Watson knew his friend's mind had already begun working. The carriage passed through the hospital's iron-barred gate and stopped in front of the main building. Several police officers were waiting at the entrance. As they entered, Watson felt the weight of the hospital's atmosphere. Long corridors, high ceilings, and faded paintings on the walls created a world detached from time. The hospital's director, Arthur Bellamy, was waiting to greet them in the lobby. He was a man in his late 40s, of medium height, neatly dressed. There was a look of concern on his face, but Watson sensed something different behind his eyes, a calculating look. Or perhaps it was just his own skepticism. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Bellamy said, extending his hand. "This is a terrible day. Dr. Halbrook was the heart and soul of this institution. I don't know what we'll do without him." Holmes shook the man's hand briefly. "My condolences, Mr. Bellamy. May we go to the scene?" "Of course, this way." Bellamy led them through the corridors to the west wing of the building. The chief physician's office was on the second floor, in the administrative section of the hospital. A police officer was standing guard at the door. When Holmes entered the room, Watson observed, as always, how suddenly his friend changed. Holmes's senses were heightened, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. It was as if a hunter tracking his prey had forgotten the rest of the world. The room was spacious and orderly. A large oak desk stood in front of the window. Medical diplomas and certificates hung on the walls. In one corner was a leather-covered armchair, and in another, a cabinet that appeared to be locked. And behind the table lay the lifeless body of Dr. Edmund Halbrook. The man was slumped in his chair. His eyes were closed, a strange serenity on his face. The cut on his throat was visible as a dark red line. Blood had stained his chest and part of the table, but there was less blood than Watson had expected. Holmes approached the body and knelt down to examine it. His eyes, like an eagle's, captured every detail. "Watson, what do you think?" Watson examined the body with professional reflexes. A single cut from left to right, deep but not surgical. A sharp knife was used. Death was quick, probably within a few minutes. "Any signs of struggle?" Watson examined the victim's hands and arms. "None. No defensive wounds. I see no skin or blood under the fingernails." Holmes stood up and began to slowly walk around the room. "Did anyone hear a scream, Inspector?" Aldridge shook his head. "No, Mr. Holmes. The night watchman heard nothing. There were no sounds from the patients either." "Interesting," said Holmes, approaching the table. "In a mental hospital, in the dead of night, a man is killed by having his throat slit, and no one hears a thing." Watson frowned. Perhaps the victim was asleep and unaware. "No, Watson." Holmes pointed to the papers on the table. "Look, the chief physician was working right before he died." The table was covered with scattered papers. Some were patient files, others administrative documents. Holmes picked up a piece of paper and held it up to the light. "Ink," he said. "These notes were written no more than 1 or 2 hours before death." Watson approached. "So the victim was awake and working?" "Yes." "And someone entered the room, approached the desk, and slit his throat. The victim didn't scream, didn't struggle, didn't even try to get up from his chair." Inspector Aldridge seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "What does this mean, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. "There are 2 possibilities, Inspector. Either the victim didn't see the attacker, which means the attacker was extraordinarily quiet and fast, or—" He turned and looked at those in the room. Or the victim saw the attacker, recognized him and trusted him, so much so that they even let them come up behind them. Watson understood what this meant. The killer is someone the victim knew. Not just someone they knew, Watson, someone they trusted. How many people in this hospital could enter the chief physician's office late at night and get that close to him? Holmes returned to the table and began examining the files. He worked silently for several minutes, occasionally picking up a piece of paper, reading it, then putting it back. "Inspector," he said finally, "these files are incomplete." Aldridge approached. "What do you mean?" Holmes pointed to the pile of files on the desk. "Look at the file sorting system here. It's in alphabetical order, starting with A and continuing. But there are gaps here. After C, it jumps straight to F. There's also a gap between M and P." Watson understood what Holmes meant. Someone took the file. Yes, and they took it in a hurry. They tried not to disturb the order but failed. This tells us that the killer didn't come just to kill. They were looking for something. Documents. Records. Holmes opened the desk drawers one by one. Most were in order, everything in its place. But one drawer caught his attention. "This drawer has been forced," he said, pointing to the metal edges. "Look, there are scratches here. Someone tried to break the lock." "Did they succeed?" Aldridge asked. Holmes opened the drawer. Inside were a few personal items, a pocket watch, some letters, a photograph. But something else caught Holmes's attention. At the bottom of the drawer, a folded piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and read it. For a moment, there was surprise on his face, then understanding. "What is this, Holmes?" Watson asked. Holmes put the paper in his pocket. "It's too early to say, Watson, but this paper could answer many questions." At that moment, Mr. Bellamy appeared at the door. "Mr. Holmes, can I be of assistance? Perhaps you'd like me to provide some information about the hospital." Holmes turned to the director. "Yes, Mr. Bellamy. Tell me about the general operation of this hospital. How many patients are there? How many staff members?" Bellamy entered the room and began speaking. "We currently have 132 patients. Our staff, including doctors, nurses, and support staff, numbers approximately 60. 15 people work the night shift." "Who can enter the chief physician's office during the night shift?" Bellamy thought for a moment. "Theoretically, anyone with a key. But in practice, only the on-duty nurses and security guards are present in this wing during night hours." "And you?" Bellamy paused for a moment. Yes, I have a key too. As the director, I have access to all rooms. But I was at home last night." Holmes nodded, but his face gave nothing away. "How was the chief physician's mood in recent days? Did he seem anxious? Restless?" Something flickered in Bellamy's eyes for a moment. "Dr. Halbrook was always very dedicated to his work. In recent weeks, yes, maybe he seemed a little more tired, but I don't know why." "Understood, Mr. Bellamy. That's enough for now. I'd like to tour the hospital and speak with some people." Bellamy bowed his head. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. You can reach me for anything you need." After the man left the room, Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. In the hospital garden, grey-clad trees and well-kept lawns were visible. In the distance, a group of patients were taking a supervised walk. "What do you think, Holmes?" Watson asked. Holmes turned and looked at his friend. "I think, Watson, that this murder was not committed in anger, nor in passion. It was a calculated act. The killer knew exactly what he was doing. He came silently, killed silently, and left silently. He took documents, left no evidence. A professional killer, perhaps, or someone who had a lot to lose. This murder, Watson, was not committed to end something, but to keep something going. The chief physician knew something or was going to do something, and someone stopped him. Watson felt the weight of his friend's words. So, what do we do now? Holmes took out his pipe and lit it. Now, we'll go deep into this hospital, Watson. We'll look at the walls, the corridors, the faces of the people. Because inside this building, behind the innocent-looking faces, a killer is hiding. And that killer made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. What mistake? Holmes smiled for a moment. But there was no joy in that smile, only the determination of a hunter who has spotted his prey. I don't know yet, Watson, but I will find it. I always do. The faint light from the window illuminated Holmes's face, while indistinct sounds from the corridors of Blackthorn Mental Hospital could be heard. Patients, nurses, doctors. They all lived in their own worlds, but within these walls, a secret was hidden, and Sherlock Holmes would do anything to uncover it. Watson came over to his friend and gently touched his shoulder. I'm with you, Holmes, as always. Holmes nodded. I know, Watson, and I'll need it, because this case is much deeper than it appears. I can feel it. Outside, the London fog was slowly beginning to lift, but the darkness over Blackthorn was just beginning to settle. Chapter 2. The Normal Patients. In the afternoon, the corridors of Blackthorn Mental Hospital were enveloped in an eerie silence. The news of the chief physician's death had spread throughout the building, leaving worried expressions on the faces of the staff. Holmes and Watson, along with Inspector Aldridge, had begun examining different sections of the hospital. Holmes had said he wanted to go to the administrative section to examine the hospital records, but first he had to do something else. He had to see the patients. Because in a murder committed in a mental hospital, the patients were always the first suspects, and Holmes couldn't proceed without ruling out that possibility. Head nurse Martha Calloway had been assigned to accompany them. She was a woman in her early 40s with stern features but a spark of compassion in her eyes. She had worked at Blackthorn for 15 years and knew the hospital like the back of her hand. Mr. Holmes, Calloway said as she led them down. The corridor. Most of our patients are harmless. Yes, some have difficult moments, crises, but someone who would kill Dr. Halbrook, I can't imagine it. Holmes studied the woman's face. Were you close to Dr. Halbrook, Miss Calloway? A flicker of pain crossed the nurse's face. He was a good man, Mr. Holmes. He truly cared about the patients. He didn't see them as just case numbers. He knew each one's name, their story. She paused. He had changed in the last few weeks, though. How had he changed? Calloway slowed her pace. He'd become quieter, thoughtful. Sometimes he'd stay in his office for hours poring over files. Once I asked him if something was wrong. He just said, "Everything's fine, Martha." But his eyes told a different story. Watson jotted down a few things in his notebook. Holmes continued walking without saying a word. The hospital was divided into different sections. There was a wing for calm patients, a secure section for more serious cases, and an observation area for newly admitted patients. Holmes said he especially wanted to see the observation area. "Why there?" Aldridge asked. Because, Inspector, the new patients haven't fully adapted to the system yet. If they know anything about this murder, they may not have learned to keep quiet yet. The observation wing was on the east side of the hospital. Rooms lined a long corridor, each housing 1 or 2 patients. The windows were high up and protected by iron bars. The walls were painted white, but had turned grey over time, giving them a faded appearance. Holmes walked down the corridor, looking carefully into each room. Some patients seemed lost in their own worlds, staring at the walls or muttering to themselves. Others looked curiously at the visitors. Holmes stopped in front of one room. Inside, a man sat in a chair near the window. He was about 38 years old, with regular features and slightly thinning hair. His eyes were open and clear. When he saw Holmes, he sat up slightly. "Who is this?" Holmes asked, turning to the nurse. Calloway looked at the list in her hand. "Leonard Marsh, admitted 3 weeks ago. Diagnosis: severe melancholy and detachment from reality." Holmes studied the man for a few seconds. Then he opened the door and went inside. Watson and Aldridge followed hesitantly. Leonard Marsh looked at the visitors but showed no sign of fear or anxiety. On the contrary, there was an expression of curiosity on his face. "Good day," said Holmes. "I'm Sherlock Holmes. This gentleman is Dr. Watson and the other is Inspector Aldridge. May we have a few words with you?" Marsh bowed his head slightly. "Sherlock Holmes, I've heard your name. They write about you in the newspapers. You're a detective, aren't you?" Holmes sat down opposite the man. "Yes. I'm investigating an incident that occurred here last night." "The head physician was murdered," Marsh said in a calm tone, as if discussing the weather. "I heard about it this morning." The nurses were whispering. Watson noticed the man's manner of speaking. His sentences were coherent, logical. He didn't sound like someone who had lost touch with reality. Holmes had noticed the same thing. "Mr. Marsh, could you tell me about yourself? How did you end up here?" A bitter smile appeared on Marsh's face. "How did I get here?" "Good question, Mr. Holmes. I'm an accountant, or I was. I worked for a small firm. Then one day my family brought me here. They said I was dangerous, that I could harm myself and others." "And you? Do you feel dangerous?" Marsh looked into Holmes's eyes. "Mr. Holmes, I've never hurt anyone in my life. I couldn't even kill a fly. But here I am, behind these iron bars." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh. Perhaps we'll meet again." As they left the room, Watson whispered, "Holmes, that man didn't seem very crazy to me." "Because he isn't, Watson," said Holmes, keeping his voice low. "That man is one of the most sane people I've ever seen. There's no fear in his eyes, no anger, only acceptance. And that bothers me even more." Aldridge furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he continued walking down the corridor and began looking into other rooms. He visited a few more rooms, spoke to a few more patients, and each time, Watson's unease grew. Because most of the patients Holmes spoke to were like Leonard Marsh. They spoke coherently. They gave logical answers. They understood the questions and responded appropriately. These were very different from the typical cases he saw in mental hospitals. When they left the observation wing, Holmes turned to Mrs. Calloway. "I want to see the files on these patients, especially those admitted in the last month." Calloway hesitated. "Mr. Holmes, patient files are confidential. You need to discuss this with Mr. Bellamy." "Then let's speak with Mr. Bellamy." The director's office was one floor below the chief physician's office. Arthur Bellamy was sitting behind his desk, sorting through a pile of papers. When Holmes and the others entered, he quickly stood up. "Mr. Holmes, can I assist you?" "Yes, Mr. Bellamy. I need to see the files of patients admitted in the last month." A shadow passed over Bellamy's face for a moment. "That's a rather unusual request, Mr. Holmes. Patient files are covered by medical confidentiality." "Mr. Bellamy," said Holmes, a steely hardness in his voice, "your chief physician has been murdered. I am here at Scotland Yard's invitation, and if you prevent me from seeing these files now, I will ask Inspector Aldridge to issue a formal arrest warrant and seize all hospital records. Which would you prefer?" Bellamy's jaw tightened, but then his shoulders slumped. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I'll assist you." An officer soon arrived with a thick stack of files. Holmes settled into a corner of the desk and began examining the files. Watson looked over his friend's shoulder. The first file belonged to Leonard Marsh. Holmes turned the pages one by one. Admission date, diagnosis, treatment notes. Everything looked in order. But Holmes's eyes stopped at one point. "Watson, look at this." Watson leaned in. The diagnosis section read, "Severe melancholy, periodic detachment from reality, potential danger to society." "What's wrong with that?" Watson asked. Holmes opened another file, then another, and another. He laid 5 files side by side. "Read," he said. Watson looked at the files, and then he saw it. 5 different patients, 5 different names, 5 different histories. But the diagnosis section contained almost identical sentences. Severe melancholy, periodic detachment from reality, potential danger to society. Word for word. "This can't be a coincidence," said Watson. "It can't be," said Holmes. "And look, they all have the same signature at the bottom." Watson looked at the signatures. They were all written in the same handwriting. "Dr. S. Price." Holmes turned to Bellamy. "Who is Dr. Simon Price?" Bellamy looked away. "He's a young doctor. He's been working with us for about 6 months. "And has he examined most of the patients admitted in the last month?" I'm not exactly sure, Mr. Holmes. Each doctor has their own patient load." Holmes continued shuffling through the files. A few minutes later, he looked up. 23 new patients were admitted in the last 4 weeks. Dr. Price examined and diagnosed 17 of them. And in 12 of those 17 patients, the diagnosis text is almost word for word the same. Aldridge stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Holmes stood up. "It means this, Inspector. Either Dr. Price is the laziest doctor in the world and is copying and pasting the same diagnosis for every patient, or systematic misdiagnoses are being made here." Bellamy quickly interjected. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Price is a respected medical professional." "I'm not making an accusation, Mr. Bellamy. I'm just stating what I see. And what I see is a pattern, a system." Holmes gathered the files. "I'll be borrowing these files." Bellamy seemed about to protest, but Holmes's gaze silenced him. That night, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes spent hours examining the files. Watson occasionally brought his friend tea, sometimes sitting beside him to read his notes. As midnight approached, Holmes suddenly stood up. "I've found it, Watson." Watson rubbed his sleepy eyes and stood up. "What did you find?" Holmes spread several files across the table. "Look at these dates, the dates of patients admitted over the last 4 weeks." Watson looked. November 3rd, November 4th, November 5th, November 10th, November 11th, November 17th, November 18th, November 24th, November 25th. There are clusters on certain days, Watson said. But does that mean anything? By itself, perhaps not. But now look at this. Holmes pulled out another piece of paper. It was a calendar of the government's payments to mental hospitals. The government makes 2 payments to mental hospitals each month, at the beginning and in the middle of the month. The payment amount for patients classified as dangerous is 3 times that of normal patients. Watson's eyes widened. So these patients were admitted just before the payment dates. Yes, and they're all classified as dangerous. Melancholy and detachment from reality fall under the potential danger category in the government's classification. That means higher payments. Watson was beginning to grasp the scale of the situation. Someone is exploiting the system. They're admitting healthy people as patients and siphoning money from the state. Holmes shook his head. And this isn't something a single doctor could do, Watson. It requires someone inside the system. Someone who can alter records, approve admissions, pass inspections. Someone at the management level. Yes. Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. London's night lights glowed like indistinct points in the foggy air. And the chief physician noticed this, Watson. The files weren't randomly disorganized on his desk. Someone took them because the chief physician was examining them. I think Dr. Halbrook discovered this pattern, and someone killed him to prevent him from exposing it. Watson came over to his friend. But who? Bellamy? Holmes turned around. Bellamy is the most obvious suspect. As the manager, he's responsible for all financial transactions. But I don't have any proof yet. I'm just seeing a pattern, a suspicion. That's not enough. So what will we do? Holmes sat back in his chair and lit his pipe. Tomorrow we'll speak with Dr. Price, and we'll examine Blackthorn's financial records. If there's a pattern here, we need to follow the money trail. Watson looked at his friend. There was no fatigue on Holmes's face, only determination. This was the Holmes he knew, the man who wouldn't stop until he solved a puzzle. Holmes, Watson said hesitantly, these patients, if they really are healthy, what will happen to them? Holmes lowered his pipe for a moment. A rare softness appeared in his eyes. We'll save them, Watson. If these people are being held behind those walls unjustly, we'll get them out. But first, I need to find those who created this system, because as they are freed, others will enter those wards. Watson nodded. You're right. Holmes returned to the files. But first he said one last thing. And Watson, remember Leonard Marsh? The look in that man's eyes, resignation, despair. Someone did this to him. Someone stole his freedom, his identity, his life, and that someone will pay. As night fell over London, a light shone from the window on Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes searched among the files for the truth, and the truth awaited him in the dark corridors of Blackthorn. The next morning, Holmes and Watson returned to Blackthorn. This time, they had a specific target, Dr. Simon Price. The young doctor was found in a small examination room in the west wing of the hospital. He was 31 years old, thin, with a pale face. The dark circles under his eyes showed he had spent sleepless nights. When Holmes and Watson entered, he quickly stood up. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice trembling slightly, I was expecting you. I mean, I anticipated you would come. I thought you might want to ask questions about the chief physician." Holmes studied the man carefully. "Sit down, Dr. Price. I do have a few questions, yes, but relax. I'm not here to accuse you." Price sat down but was still tense. His hands were trembling slightly. "Dr. Price, how many patients have you admitted in the last 4 weeks?" Holmes asked. Price thought. "I don't know the exact number. 15, maybe 20. 17, said Holmes. "And you gave the same diagnosis to 12 of those 17 patients. Severe melancholy, periodic detachment from reality, potential danger to society. Do you remember that sentence?" Price's face paled. It's a standard diagnostic text. We use it for similar cases." "Similar cases? Did you examine these patients, Dr. Price? Did you really examine them? Did you talk to them? Did you research their histories?" Price couldn't respond. He was just staring at the table. Holmes softened his voice. "Dr. Price, I said I didn't come here to accuse you, and I meant it. Because you're not the architect of this system. You're just a tool. Someone brought you these patients, didn't they? Someone told you to make these diagnoses." Price raised his head. Fear and guilt were in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, I shouldn't have done it. I know. But they told me. They told me these patients were already dangerous. Their families didn't want them. It was to protect them." "Who told you?" Price's lips trembled, but he didn't name a name. He just shook his head. Holmes stood up. "I understand, Dr. Price. That's enough, for now. But know this, the truth will come out. And on that day, it'll be in your best interest to be on the right side." As they left the room, Watson whispered, "He's afraid, Holmes. He's very afraid of someone." "Yes," said Holmes, "and the source of that fear will provide our answers. But for now, we must go elsewhere, to the chief physician's house." Chapter 3. The Second Death. Mrs. Dorothy Halbrook appeared crushed under the weight of her husband's death. 54 years old, she was once clearly beautiful, but now grief had left her looking pale and worn. She greeted Holmes and Watson in the sitting room of their modest home in Kensington. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and weary. "The police have already come. They asked their questions. I told them everything I know." Holmes bowed his head politely. "I understand, Mrs. Halbrook, and I apologize for disturbing you at this difficult time. But I want to find your husband's killer, and for that, I need your help." The woman invited them to sit down. While the maid brought tea, Holmes carefully examined the room. The walls were covered with family photos. Edmund Halbrook as a young doctor on his wedding day, at hospital openings. Traces of a happy life. "Mrs. Halbrook," Holmes said as he took his tea, "how was your husband in the last few weeks? Did you notice any changes in his behavior?" The woman held her cup between her hands and thought. Edmund was always very dedicated to his work. He would work late into the night. But in the last few weeks, he was different. How different? He seemed withdrawn. Silence had settled over him. When I woke up at night, I would find him standing at the window, looking out into the unknown. When I asked him what he was thinking, he would simply say, "Nothing, dear." But what was hidden in his eyes was much heavier than his words. Watson took notes. Holmes, meanwhile, was studying the woman's face. "Did she mention anything to you? Any trouble at the hospital?" Mrs. Halbrook hesitated. "Once, about 10 days ago. She came home very upset. She never brought her work home, but that night, she didn't even speak at dinner. Then, before going to bed, she turned to me and said, "Dorothy, sometimes doing the right thing can cost you everything, but you still have to do it." I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and said, "You'll understand soon." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he say anything else? Any names, any details?" "No, but one night I saw him writing something in his study. When I went over, he quickly closed the papers, as if he wanted to hide them. That wasn't like him. There were no secrets between us." "Where are those papers now, Mrs. Halbrook?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know. After his death, I searched his study. The police searched it too, but we didn't find anything that seemed important." Holmes stood up. "May I see the study?" Mrs. Halbrook led them to a small room at the back of the house. This was Dr. Halbrook's personal space. Shelves full of books, an old desk, a leather-covered chair. Everything was tidy, but Holmes's eyes scanned every corner. He shuffled through the papers on the desk. Most were medical articles, letters, notes. But something was missing. Holmes opened the desk drawers. They were empty. "Mrs. Halbrook, did your husband keep important documents here?" "Yes, always, especially in the top drawer, which he kept locked." Holmes examined the drawer. The lock was in place, but there were signs of forced entry. "This drawer has been opened, recently." Watson approached. "A thief?" "Perhaps, or someone came here before your husband was killed and took whatever they were looking for." Holmes turned to Mrs. Halbrook. "Did anyone come to the house in the days before his death?" "Someone you didn't know?" the woman thought. "No." "Wait, yes, a man came. He said he was Edmund's colleague from the hospital. I was out. The maid opened the door. Edmund took him to his study. They stayed for about half an hour." "What did this man look like?" "I asked the maid. She said he was of medium height, neatly dressed, in his 40s. She couldn't remember any more details." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. This description matched Arthur Bellamy, but it could also match dozens of other men. "Thank you, Mrs. Halbrook," said Holmes. "You've been very helpful." On the way back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent in the carriage. Watson didn't want to interrupt his friend's thoughts, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What are you thinking about, Holmes?" Holmes was looking out of the window. "I think Dr. Halbrook discovered something important, and he documented his discovery. But those documents are now missing. They were taken from both his office at the hospital and his study at home." "By the killer?" "Most likely, yes. The killer didn't just kill Halbrook. He also destroyed the evidence. This is a planned murder, Watson. Cold-blooded and calculated." As the carriage approached Baker Street, a mounted policeman stopped them. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Aldridge is summoning you urgently to Blackthorn. Something has happened." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "A patient has died, sir. Tonight." When they arrived at Blackthorn Mental Hospital, Holmes immediately sensed something was wrong. The hospital's atmosphere felt even heavier than before. The staff whispered in the corridors. Fear was etched on their faces. Inspector Aldridge met them in the entrance hall. His face was pale. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. Tonight one of our patients died." "Who?" Holmes asked. "Leonard Marsh." Watson looked at Holmes with a shocked expression. The man they had spoken to just yesterday. He remembered the acceptance in his eyes. That calm, rational voice. Now that man was dead. There was no emotion on Holmes's face, but his eyes had darkened. How did he die? The doctors say it was a heart attack. During the night shift, the nurses found him dead in his bed. Holmes began walking quickly. I want to see the body. Leonard Marsh's body lay in a cold room in the basement, which the hospital used as a morgue. Watson, following his professional instincts, began to examine the body. Holmes stood a step behind, observing everything. Marsh looked as if he were sleeping in bed. There was no expression of pain on his face. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted. Watson carefully examined the body. He checked the pulse points, examined the pupils, and looked at the color of the skin. A few minutes later, he frowned and sat up. Holmes, this doesn't look like a heart attack. Explain. Watson gathered his thoughts. In a heart attack, we usually see certain signs: cyanosis or blue discoloration on the face, a change in color on the lips or fingernails. Sometimes signs of clutching, meaning the man is found clutching his chest. But here, there's none of that. Holmes approached. What else do you see? Watson examined Marsh's hands. There's a slight bluish tint under the nails. This could indicate oxygen deprivation, but not from a heart attack, more like respiratory failure. Poison. Watson hesitated. Possibly. Some poisons, especially slow-acting ones, can mimic a heart attack. The victim dies while asleep, unaware. Holmes slowly circled the body. What kind of poison causes these symptoms? There are several possibilities. Digitalis in excessive doses causes heart failure. Belladonna paralyzes the respiratory system, or... Watson paused. Arsenic in low doses. Administered over a long period, it can cause a death that mimics a heart attack. Holmes turned to the nurse. Mrs. Calloway was waiting at the door, her face as white as chalk. Mrs. Calloway, what was given to Mr. Marsh in the last 24 hours? Medication? Food? Drink? Calloway rubbed her hands together as she thought. He ate standard meals, and in the evening he was given a sedative prescribed by the doctor. Which doctor? Dr. Price. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. Dr. Price again. Was this sedative normally given to Mr. Marsh? Holmes asked. Calloway shook his head. No, it was his first time. Dr. Price said the patient was having trouble sleeping at night, and that a sedative would help. Holmes's jaw tightened. I want to see that medication, and I want a blood sample taken from Mr. Marsh. Dr. Watson, can you do that? Watson nodded. Of course. A few hours later, Holmes and Watson were in the hospital's small laboratory. Watson was examining the blood sample, performing basic chemical tests. Holmes was analyzing the medication prescribed by Dr. Price. The results confirmed Holmes's suspicions. Arsenic, Watson said, looking at the results. There are traces of arsenic in the blood. A low dose, but it's definitely there. Holmes held the medicine bottle up to the light. And this sedative isn't pure. There's something in it. The colour is slightly different. Someone added poison to the medicine. Yes, and that someone wanted Leonard Marsh to die tonight. Holmes placed the bottle on the table. The question is, why? Why was Marsh the target? Watson thought. We spoke with him yesterday. Maybe someone saw that and got worried. Possible, but there's something more. Important, Watson. Holmes took his notebook out of his pocket. Marsh had requested a meeting with the chief physician. I asked Mrs. Calloway. 2 days before his death, Marsh had submitted a request. He wanted to speak privately with Dr. Halbrook. About what? It doesn't say in the petition. But think, Watson. Marsh was a healthy man. He was locked up in this hospital with a wrong diagnosis, and he wanted to see the chief physician. Maybe to tell the truth. Maybe to ask for help. Watson's eyes widened. And the chief physician was murdered, so the meeting never took place. Yes, but Marsh was still a threat. Because he knew what had been done to him. And if he spoke to the right person, he could expose everything. Holmes walked to the window. Evening was falling outside. Blackthorn's silhouette stood like a dark shadow against the setting sun. Someone is silencing the witnesses, Watson. First the chief physician, now Marsh. This is no coincidence. This is a clean-up operation. Watson came over to his friend. So what do we do now? Should we have Dr. Price arrested? Holmes shook his head. Price is a pawn. Yes, he prescribed the medicine, but he didn't put the poison in it. I'm certain of that. How can you be so sure? Because Price is afraid, Watson. I saw it when we spoke to him yesterday. That man is afraid of his own shadow. Someone like that doesn't plan murders. He follows orders. Then who's giving the orders? Holmes turned and looked Watson straight in the eye. To find that out, we need to follow the money trail. Tomorrow, we'll examine the hospital's financial records, and we'll have a serious talk with Arthur Bellamy. That night, Holmes didn't sleep. He spent hours in the sitting room on Baker Street, poring over files and notes. Watson woke up occasionally to check on his friend. Each time he found Holmes in the same position, sitting in his chair, smoke rising from his pipe, his eyes fixed on the papers. As dawn broke, Holmes finally stood up. There were signs of fatigue on his face, but his eyes shone with determination. "Watson," he said as his friend entered the room. "I found something." Watson approached, still bleary-eyed. "What did you find?" Holmes showed him a piece of paper. "This is the paper I took from the drawer in the head doctor's office. Do you remember?" Watson remembered. Holmes had found a piece of paper in the drawer on the first day, but hadn't shared its contents. "This is a list written in Dr. Halbrook's handwriting. There are 7 names, and I now recognize all of them." Watson looked at the list. The first name was Leonard Marsh. "These are patients admitted with misdiagnoses," said Holmes, "and Halbrook planned to release them. This list was a freedom list." Watson felt the gravity of the situation. And Marsh was killed. Yes, there are 7 names on the list. 1 is dead, 6 are still alive. Holmes put the paper in his pocket. "We need to protect these 6 people, Watson, because the killer may try to silence them too." Watson looked at his friend's face. "Holmes, this is no longer just a murder investigation. This is a war." Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, and to win this war, we need to know our enemy. Today, we will uncover Blackthorn's darkest secrets." Outside, London was waking up. The sounds of street vendors, the creaking of horse-drawn carriages, the sounds of daily life. But to Holmes, these sounds were distant and meaningless. His mind was wandering through Blackthorn's dark corridors, among death and lies. And there, somewhere, a killer was waiting, planning his next move. Holmes took his coat and walked to the door. "Come, Watson, we have no time to lose." Chapter 4. The Chief Doctor's Final Step. When they arrived at Blackthorn Mental Hospital early that morning, Holmes's face wore a stern, determined expression. Watson knew that look well. It was the cool composure of a hunter who had found his trail. There was no turning back now. Inspector Aldridge met them at the entrance. His face was weary and anxious. Leonard Marsh's death had taken the investigation into a whole new dimension. There were now not one, but two suspicious deaths, and the connection between them was too obvious to ignore. "Mr. Holmes," Aldridge said as he ushered them inside, "I reported Marsh's death to my superiors last night. They're taking it seriously. But without concrete evidence, they're pressuring me not to make any arrests." Holmes nodded. "We'll find evidence, Inspector. But first, I need to examine the Chief Physician's office again, and this time, I'll look in every corner." Aldridge hesitated. "The office is sealed, Mr. Holmes. It's being preserved as evidence." "Then break the seal. This is a murder investigation, and I think I missed something in that room." Dr. Halbrook's office hadn't changed since their first visit. The body had been removed, but bloodstains were still visible on the desk and floor. The room still carried the cold breath of death. Holmes took a deep breath as he entered the room. His eyes began to systematically scan the room. On his first visit, he had focused on the files and the desk. Now, he was looking for something else. "Watson," he said, standing in the middle of the room. "Someone entered this room and took documents. We know that. But they couldn't take everything, because they were in a hurry. And people in a hurry make mistakes." Watson tried to figure out what his friend was looking for. What kind of mistake? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he approached the bookshelves on the walls. He examined the shelves one by one, looked behind the books, pulled some out, and glanced inside. He worked silently for several minutes. Then he stopped. He was holding a thick, leather-bound book. The cover read, "Medical Jurisprudence." Holmes opened the book and flipped through the pages. Several pieces of paper fell out towards the middle. "Here," said Holmes, picking up the papers from the floor. The chief physician hid important documents between the pages of books. The person who searched his desk didn't check here. Watson approached and looked at the papers. They were handwritten notes. Some contained dates and names. Others were long paragraphs of thoughts. Holmes read the papers carefully. The expression on his face grew more serious with each line. "These notes, Watson. These notes explain everything." Watson tried to read over his friend's shoulder. "What does it say?" Holmes spread the notes on the table and showed them to Watson. The chief physician conducted a systematic investigation over the last 3 weeks. He became suspicious and examined the records. It says here, "I reviewed the files of patients admitted over the last 4 months. I noticed a disturbing pattern. The same diagnostic texts, the same signatures, the same date ranges. This cannot be a coincidence." Watson read the rest of the notes. "Is there more?" Holmes nodded and showed him the next sheet. "There are names here." The chief physician listed the cases he found suspicious, and he added notes next to each one. Watson examined the list. Leonard Marsh's name was there. Next to it was written, "Accountant brought in by his family. His brother's will is ongoing. Suspicious. The patient appears completely lucid." Another name, Thomas Whitmore, former bank clerk, brought in by his wife. Inheritance case pending. Patient speaks coherently and logically. And another, Samuel Briggs, merchant, brought in by his partner. Business dispute. The patient shows no signs of psychosis. Watson was beginning to grasp the horror of the situation. These people, they're all connected to inheritance or money issues. "Yes," said Holmes. The chief physician reached the same conclusion. "Look here." He showed another piece of paper. This is a page from his personal diary. The date is 3 days before his death. Holmes read aloud. I have no doubt now. Blackthorn has ceased to be a treatment facility and has become a prison. Healthy people are being locked up here for various interests, and someone is making a lot of money from this. I have to stop this system. Tomorrow, I will submit a report to the Board of Trustees and demand that these patients be released immediately. My conscience commands me to do so. Watson took a deep breath. So the chief physician knew everything, and he was about to expose it. Yes, and someone stopped him. Holmes gathered his notes. But there's something more important, Watson. Look at this. Holmes pulled out one last piece of paper. It was a draft of an official document. It bore the letterhead of Blackthorn Mental Hospital. This is a draft release order, said Holmes. The chief physician had prepared a document ordering the immediate release of 7 patients. The date was set for the day after his death. Watson examined the document. 7 names were listed. Starting with Leonard Marsh, they were all names they had seen before. This document never came into effect, said Watson, because the chief physician was murdered before he could sign it. Look, the signature space is blank. The murder was committed exactly 8 hours before this order was to take effect. Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. In the hospital garden, a few patients were taking a supervised walk. People so close to their freedom, yet still held behind these walls. The killer timed it perfectly, Watson. If it had been 1 day later, these people would have been free, and the system would have collapsed. Watson came over to his friend. But how did the killer know that? How did he learn about the chief physician's plan? Holmes turned. Good question. And the answer must be somewhere in this room. He returned to the desk and began examining the drawers again. A few minutes later, he found something. A small envelope was wedged in the back corner of the drawer. Holmes carefully removed it and opened it. Inside was a short note. The handwriting was different from the chief physician's. Holmes read the note. Dr. Halbrook, we need to talk about the report you plan to present at tomorrow's meeting. I'll be at your office tonight at 9. Let's settle this matter between us. A.B. Watson's eyes widened. A B. Arthur Bellamy. Holmes put the note in his pocket. Most likely. And this note tells us that the murderer met with the chief physician the night before his death. But Bellamy said he was at home that night. Yes, he did. And that means either it's a lie or someone else wrote this note. Holmes paced around the table with a thoughtful expression. But the circle of suspects is narrowing, Watson. Someone from the hospital administration is behind this murder, and Bellamy is the most obvious candidate. Inspector Aldridge's face grew increasingly anxious as he listened to Holmes's findings. Mr. Holmes, these are serious accusations. Arthur Bellamy is a respected name in London. We can't accuse him outright. Holmes shook his head. I'm not accusing him yet, Inspector. But we need to keep these notes and documents as evidence. And we need to verify where Bellamy was that night, Aldridge thought. I can check his alibi. If he said he stayed home, his servants and family should confirm it. Do it. And one more thing. Holmes pulled out the patient list prepared by the chief physician from his pocket. There are 7 names on this list. 1. Leonard Marsh is dead. You need to ensure the safety of the remaining 6. Aldridge looked at the list. How am I supposed to do that? I can't take them out of the hospital. Legally, they're still patients. Then protect them inside. Send your trusted men. And prevent Dr. Price from approaching these patients, Watson interjected. Holmes, what about Price? He prescribed that medication. Holmes paused for a moment. I need to speak with Price again, but this time I'll try a different approach. Dr. Simon Price sat hunched behind his desk in the examination room. When Holmes and Watson entered, the fear on the young doctor's face was plain to see. Mr. Holmes, said Price, his voice trembling. About Marsh. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Holmes sat down across from the man, but this time his voice wasn't harsh. On the contrary, it carried an almost compassionate tone. Dr. Price, I didn't come here to accuse you. I said it yesterday and I'll say it again today. You're not the one who started this. I know that. Price looked at him in astonishment. Then, what do you want? I want the truth, and in exchange I'm offering you something. Protection. Price's eyes widened. Protection? Holmes leaned forward. Listen, Dr. Price. This system is going to collapse. There is no force that can stop it. The chief physician was murdered. A patient was poisoned, and I know everything. Soon Scotland Yard will walk through these doors, and everyone will be arrested. The question is, which side will you be on? Price rubbed his hands. His face showed signs of conflict, fear, guilt, and perhaps a hint of hope. I was just following orders, he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. They told me these patients were dangerous. Their families wanted to protect them. I was just doing my job. Who said that, Dr. Price? Who gave you those orders? Price's eyes darted toward the door, as if someone were listening. Then he spoke in a voice so low it was almost inaudible. Mr. Bellamy, everything came from him. Which patients to admit, which diagnoses to make. He told me everything. Watson quickly jotted down notes in his notebook. Holmes remained calm. And the medication given to Marsh? Did that come from Bellamy too? Price shook his head. No. Well, not exactly. Bellamy told me Marsh was having trouble sleeping. He asked me to prescribe a sedative. I wrote a normal prescription. But then, he paused. Then what happened? Then the medication came back to me from the pharmacy, from Bellamy's room. The label I wrote was on the bottle, but I never saw that bottle. I didn't send it to the pharmacy. Someone used my prescription to have that medication prepared and sent it in my name. Holmes stood up. So you didn't put the poison in? You just wrote the prescription. Yes, I swear, Mr. Holmes. I didn't kill anyone. His voice broke. I was just scared. Bellamy threatened me. He said if I didn't do as he said, he would ruin my career. I have a family, children. What could I do? Holmes looked at the young doctor. For a moment, compassion flashed in his eyes. Dr. Price, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Tomorrow, you will go to Inspector Aldridge and tell him everything. Every detail, every order, every threat. If you do this, you will be protected as a witness. If you don't, you will be tried as part of this scheme. Price shook his head, tears in his eyes. I will. I swear I will. Holmes walked toward the door, but before leaving, he turned one last time. And Dr. Price, from today onward, you will not administer any medication to any patient. You will not write any prescriptions. Is that understood? Understood, Mr. Holmes. As they left the hospital, Watson turned to his friend. Holmes, do you believe Price? Holmes paused for a moment. I do, Watson. That man is not a murderer. He is simply weak, and his weakness was exploited by others. What happens now? Can we arrest Bellamy? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. Price's statement is important, but it's not enough on its own. Bellamy could deny his words. We need more concrete evidence. What kind of evidence? Holmes answered as he got into the carriage. Money trail, Watson. Always the money trail. If Bellamy is profiting from this scheme, there must be traces somewhere. Bank records, receipts, contracts, and I will find them. As the carriage moved through the streets of London, Watson studied his friend's face. Holmes looked tired, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Holmes, Watson said hesitantly, this case, it's different. It seems to affect you differently. Holmes looked out of the window for a moment. You're right, Watson. This case is different because it's not just a murder. It's a system that makes sane people look insane and locks them up in cages. And this system continues every day. Every day, another innocent person could be locked behind those walls. Watson felt the anger in his friend's words. We'll stop this, Holmes. Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was a rare determination in his eyes. Yes, Watson, we will stop it, no matter the cost. The carriage moved toward Baker Street. Behind them, Blackthorn's dark silhouette was shrinking on the horizon. But his shadow remained in Holmes's mind. Because there, behind those walls, 6 innocent people were still waiting. And time was running out. Chapter 5. The Wrong Suspect. The next morning, unexpected news reached Baker Street. An urgent message from Inspector Aldridge pulled Holmes away from the breakfast table. Watson, take your coat. Scotland Yard has made an arrest. Watson dropped the newspaper he was holding. Bellamy? Holmes's face was dark. No, Martha Calloway, the head nurse. In the carriage, Holmes was silent. His lips were tight, his eyes distant. Watson could guess what his friend was thinking. This arrest made no sense. Calloway was loyal to the chief physician. She had no reason to kill him. When they arrived at Scotland Yard, Inspector Aldridge met them at the door. His face wore a strange expression, a mix of discomfort and embarrassment. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, come inside. I need to explain the situation to you. Aldridge's office was small and cluttered. Files, reports, and empty teacups were piled on the desk. The inspector took a deep breath after closing the door. This arrest wasn't my decision, Mr. Holmes. Pressure came from above. Chief Inspector Morrison wants the case closed immediately. Holmes frowned. On what grounds? Aldridge opened a file on his desk. A witness has come forward. Someone from the hospital staff. His name is Peter Grubb. He works as a night watchman. He claims to have seen Mrs. Calloway in the corridor outside the chief physician's office around 11 o'clock on the night of the murder. Watson leaned forward. But that's not sufficient evidence. It's normal for nurses to be in the corridors at night. True, said Aldridge. But there's more. The chief physician's office key was found on Calloway, and the murder weapon, the knife, was found near her locker. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A knife? You didn't mention a knife before. Aldridge nodded. Yes, the murder weapon was found, an ordinary knife taken from the hospital kitchen. It was hidden in the corner of the cleaning closet, under a pile of rags. And that cleaning closet was in Calloway's area of responsibility. Holmes stood up and began pacing the room. This is very convenient, isn't it? The witness, the key, the knife, everything is falling into place. Almost too convenient. Aldridge seemed to understand what Holmes meant. I thought the same thing, Mr. Holmes, but I have concrete evidence, and my superiors say this evidence is sufficient. Holmes stopped and turned to Aldridge. Can I speak with Calloway? Of course, but I must tell you something. The woman says she's innocent, and I believe her. Martha Calloway sat in one of Scotland Yard's holding cells. Her hands were on her knees, her head bowed. When Holmes and Watson entered, she raised her head. Her eyes were red, but she hadn't been crying. Her face showed anger and determination. Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice strong. Finally, perhaps you will listen to me. Holmes sat down across from the woman. I'm listening, Mrs. Calloway. Tell me what happened that night. Calloway took a deep breath. On the night of the murder, I was on the night shift. Around 10 o'clock, I began my patient rounds, my usual routine. I start in the East Wing and work my way west. Did you pass through the corridor where the chief physician's office is located? Yes, I did, around 11 o'clock. But I didn't go into the office. The door was closed and there was light coming from inside. I knew Dr. Halbrook worked late. I didn't want to disturb him. Watson took notes. Holmes was staring into the woman's eyes. Did you see anyone inside? Did you hear any sounds? Calloway thought. No, I didn't hear any sounds, but wait. I saw a shadow at the end of the corridor. Someone was turning the corner. I couldn't see their face. Just a silhouette. Could you recognize them? I'm not sure, but he was tall, and he was walking fast, as if he was trying to get somewhere. Holmes committed this information to memory. Now, tell me about the key. Did you have the key to the head nurse's office? Calloway nodded. Yes, I have a key. As head nurse, I have access to all rooms in case of emergencies. But I haven't used that key in years. I wouldn't have entered Dr. Halbrook's office without being invited. What about the knife? The knife found in the cleaning room? Anger flashed across Calloway's face. I didn't put that knife there, I swear, Mr. Holmes. Someone planted it to make me look guilty. Holmes stood up and took a few steps. Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to answer honestly. What was your relationship with Arthur Bellamy? The woman's face darkened. Bellamy? I hate that man, and he hates me too. Why? Calloway hesitated. Because I knew what he was doing. Not exactly, but I sensed something was wrong. The new patients coming to the hospital, the strange diagnoses, the inconsistencies in the records. I mentioned my concerns to Dr. Halbrook several times. Watson's eyes widened. Did you tell the chief physician? Yes, about a month ago. Dr. Halbrook listened to me and said he would look into it. I think he was starting to suspect something too. Holmes looked at Watson. Everything was coming together. Calloway had warned the chief physician. The chief physician had started investigating, and now Calloway was being framed. Mrs. Calloway, Holmes said, his voice serious, I'll get you out of here, but I need a little time. Hope flickered in the woman's eyes. Do you believe me? Holmes nodded. I do, and I promise you, the real killer will soon be in this cell. Not you. As they left Scotland Yard, Holmes walked briskly. Watson struggled to keep up with his friend. Holmes, what are you thinking? Holmes kept talking. I think someone is playing a very clever game, Watson. Calloway is the perfect scapegoat. He has the key. He was seen in the corridor. The knife was found in his area. Everything points to him. But you don't believe it. Because it's too perfect, Watson. Real crimes aren't this clean. Real killers make mistakes, but here, everything is in place. It's as if someone carefully staged the scene. Watson thought, "What do you think about the witness, Peter Grubb?" Holmes's eyes lit up. "Now that's interesting. I need to look into Grubb. Who is this man? How long has he been working at the hospital? And most importantly, does he have any connection to Bellamy?" When they returned to Baker Street, Holmes immediately got to work. He asked Watson to request Blackthorn's personnel records. A few hours later, the files sent by Aldridge arrived in their hands. Holmes opened Peter Grubb's file and examined it carefully. "Here we are," he said after a moment. "Peter Grubb, 44 years old. He's been working as a night watchman at Blackthorn for 8 months. He's had a few different jobs before that. And look at this, Watson." Watson looked at the file. "What is it?" Grubb was unemployed for 6 months before coming to Blackthorn, and his hiring date coincides exactly with the date Bellamy was appointed manager. Watson frowned. That could be a coincidence. It could be. But I don't believe in coincidences, Watson. Holmes pulled out another piece of paper. "And look at this. Grubb's address, a small flat in Whitechapel. But over the last 3 months, regular payments have been made into his bank account. Payments far exceeding his salary." Watson's eyes widened. "Bribery?" "Most likely, someone is paying Grubb, and I'd bet that someone is Arthur Bellamy." Holmes stood up and took his coat. "Watson, I need to talk to Grubb, but not officially. This man mustn't be intimidated." "What do you plan to do?" A faint smile appeared on Holmes's face. "A night visit. Grubb is on duty tonight. I'll talk to him at the hospital, in the observation booth." Watson understood his friend's intention. "I don't want you to go alone, Holmes." Holmes shook his head. "Don't come, Watson. If Grubb sees 2 people, he might run away, but a lone visitor seems less threatening." Watson wanted to protest, but he knew Holmes's resolve. "Be careful." Holmes paused as he walked toward the door. "I'm always careful, Watson. Almost always." As midnight approached, Holmes drew near the back entrance of Blackthorn. The hospital looked even more eerie in the darkness of night. The faint light filtering through the windows suggested life continued inside, but from the outside it resembled an abandoned castle. The night watchman's hut was a small structure next to the main building. The light from a gas lamp was leaking out from inside. Holmes approached quietly and knocked on the door. When the door opened, Peter Grubb's startled face appeared. He was a man in his 40s, stocky with coarse features. His eyes widened when he saw Holmes. "You? Who are you?" Holmes entered calmly. "Sherlock Holmes. You must have heard of me, Mr. Grubb." Grubb's face paled. I'm on duty. I can't receive visitors." Holmes scanned the cabin. A small table, objios, chair, a few books, and on the table a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "I don't want to disturb you, Mr. Grubb. I just have a few questions about the night of the murder." Grubb tried to close the door, but Holmes was quicker. He placed his hand on the door and looked the man straight in the eye. "Mr. Grubb, I'll give you 2 options. First, you talk to me here calmly. Second, tomorrow morning Scotland Yard will arrest you with a warrant and you'll explain everything there, on record. Which do you prefer?" The fear on Grubb's face deepened. He hesitated for a few seconds, then his shoulders slumped. He opened the door and let Holmes in. Holmes sat down in the chair and studied the man carefully. "Now, Mr. Grubb, you said you saw Martha Calloway in the hallway on the night of the murder. Is that correct?" Grubb looked away. Yes, I saw her. What time? Around 11. Holmes nodded. And what exactly did you see? Grubb licked his lips. She was walking down the hallway toward the chief physician's office. Did you see him go into the office? Grubb hesitated. I'm not sure. I think he did. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You think, or are you certain? Those are two very different things, Mr. Grubb. The man began to sweat. I just said what I saw. Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Grubb, let me tell you something. I've studied the timeline. The murder was committed between approximately 11 and 12 at night. This is corroborated by records showing that Mrs. Calloway was doing patient rounds at that time. She started in the East Wing and moved westward. And according to the records, at 11:30 she administered medication to a patient in the West Wing. Grubb's face grew even paler. Holmes continued. The head doctor's office is directly opposite the West Wing. If Mrs. Calloway was in that corridor at 11 o'clock, how could she have been at the far end of the West Wing at 11:30? That distance is at least a 15-minute walk. And that means Calloway didn't have time for the murder. Grubb shifted in his chair. I only said what I saw. Holmes stood up and leaned toward the man. No, Mr. Grubb. You said what you were told to say. Someone wanted you to claim you saw Mrs. Calloway in that corridor, and they paid you for it. Grubb's eyes widened in horror. How? Your bank records, Mr. Grubb. Regular payments have been made into your account over the last 3 months. 3 times your salary. Where did that money come from? Grubb's resistance crumbled. His hands were trembling. I shouldn't have done it, I know. But I had no money. I had debts, and that man— Which man? Grubb whispered. Bellamy. Mr. Bellamy. He came to me the day after the murder. He said I had to tell the police I saw Calloway. Otherwise, I'd lose my job. And if I did, I'd make good money. Holmes sat up, a glint of triumph in his eyes. And you agreed? Yes, I agreed. But I swear, Mr. Holmes, I had nothing to do with the murder. I only lied for the money. Holmes walked to the door. Tomorrow morning you'll go to Scotland Yard, Mr. Grubb, and you'll tell them everything. What Bellamy told you, how much money he paid you, everything. Grubb looked hopelessly. But Bellamy, he'll destroy me. Holmes turned. Bellamy will soon be preoccupied with his own problems, Mr. Grubb. He won't have time to worry about you. As Holmes walked away from the hospital in the darkness of night, the final pieces fell into place in his mind. Bellamy had arranged a witness. He had planted the evidence. He had planned everything. But he had made a mistake. The timeline. And Sherlock Holmes never overlooked mistakes. Now the final step remained. Bellamy's financial records, the money trail. And then the truth would come to light. Chapter 6. The logic leading to the director. Early the next morning, a meeting was held on Baker Street. Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Aldridge were gathered in the sitting room. Files, notes, and maps were spread out on the table. Holmes had not slept all night, yet there was a sharp gleam in his eyes. "Inspector," said Holmes, standing up. "I spoke with Peter Grubb last night. The man confessed. Bellamy told him to accuse Calloway in exchange for money." Relief spread across Aldridge's face. "That's wonderful, Mr. Holmes. We can release Calloway." "Yes, release him, but we can't arrest Bellamy yet." Watson frowned. "Why? Isn't Grubb's statement enough?" Holmes shook his head. "Grubb committed perjury. That's a serious crime, but it's not murder. And Bellamy can refute Grubb's words. He can say, "The man is lying, trying to frame me." Which word will a jury believe? That of a respected hospital director, or that of a night watchman who admitted to lying for money? Aldridge seemed to grasp the difficulty of the situation. "Then what should we do?" Holmes pointed to the files on the table. "We must follow the money trail. Bellamy must be making a lot of money from this scheme. If we can prove that, we'll also prove the motive for the murder." Watson leaned forward. "Can we examine the hospital's financial records?" Holmes nodded. "We will, but the hospital records alone won't suffice. We also need to investigate Bellamy's personal finances. Bank accounts, property, expenditures." Aldridge thought. "We'll need a court order for the bank records. That could take some time." "Time is working against us, Inspector. There are 6 more patients on the list, and if Bellamy feels threatened, he might try to silence them too." Watson asked anxiously. "Can we protect the patients?" Aldridge shook his head. "I sent 2 of my men to the hospital. They're keeping a discreet watch, but this can't go on for long." Holmes walked to the window and looked out. London's morning. Fog was slowly lifting. The streets were beginning to come alive, a normal day for normal people. But behind Blackthorn's walls, nothing was normal. "Inspector," Holmes said, turning, "give me 3 days. In 3 days I'll have enough evidence to arrest Bellamy." Aldridge hesitated. 3 days is a long time, Mr. Holmes. My superiors are pressuring me." "I know. But if we rush, Bellamy could escape, or his lawyers could cover everything up. This man is rich and has powerful connections. To beat him, our evidence needs to be watertight." Aldridge thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mr. Holmes, 3 days. But after 3 days, I need something concrete in my hands." Holmes smiled slightly. "It will be, Inspector, I promise." The first step was to examine the hospital's financial records. Holmes obtained an official request letter from Aldridge and went to Blackthorn in the afternoon. Watson was with him, as usual. Arthur Bellamy greeted them in his office. He wore a polite smile, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. He must have heard that Calloway had been released, and that Grubb had confessed. "Mr. Holmes," Bellamy said, leaning back in his chair, "seeing you again is a surprise." Holmes sat down across from him. His face showed no emotion. "Mr. Bellamy, as an official request from Scotland Yard, I need to examine the hospital's financial records." Bellamy's eyes narrowed for a moment. "Financial records? What does that have to do with this murder investigation?" "Everything could be relevant, Mr. Bellamy, especially when it comes to the motive for the murder." Bellamy stared at Holmes for a few seconds. Then he shrugged. "Of course, Mr. Holmes, we have nothing to hide. I'll tell our accountant to prepare the necessary documents for you." Holmes nodded. "I'd also like to see the hospital kitchen." This time the unease on Bellamy's face was more pronounced. "The kitchen? Why?" "The murder weapon was a knife taken from the kitchen. I want to verify that." Bellamy stood up with a forced smile. "Of course, I can take you there." The hospital kitchen was in the basement of the building. It was a large, stone-floored area with big stoves, counters, and shelves. Several cooks and kitchen staff were busy preparing lunch. When Holmes entered, everyone stopped and watched him with curious glances. Holmes walked over to the section where the knives were stored. On the wall, knives of various sizes were hanging. Each had a label beneath it. and one label was empty. "This empty space," Holmes said, pointing. "There's a knife missing here." The head chef, an old, plump man, stepped forward. "Yes, sir. That knife was taken as the murder weapon. The police took it." Holmes studied the man carefully. "Who can use these knives? Everyone?" The chef shook his head. "No, sir. The kitchen is locked after 10 o'clock at night. Only those with the key can enter." "Who has the key?" The cook thought for a moment. "I have one, of course, and Mr. Bellamy has one. Management has all the keys." Holmes turned to Bellamy. The manager's face was expressionless, but something stirred in his eyes. "Mr. Bellamy," said Holmes, "did you enter the kitchen on the night of the murder?" Bellamy replied quickly. "No, I didn't. I was at home that night." "But you have a key." "Yes, I have a key. That doesn't mean I entered the kitchen." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I see, Mr. Bellamy. Thank you." When they entered the accounting office, Holmes began his real work. There were piles of ledgers, invoices, and receipts on the desk. Watson sat down next to his friend and began taking notes. Holmes worked systematically. First, he examined the hospital's income. Monthly income statements for the past year, government payments, donations, and other sources of income. A few hours later, he turned to Watson. "Look at this, Watson." Watson looked at the table Holmes was pointing to. "What should I see?" "The number of patients has increased, but the rate of increase is not proportional to the increase in income." Holmes opened another notebook. "Look, the number of patients admitted in the last 4 months has increased by 25% compared to the previous 4 months. But the increase in income is 40%. The state pays mental hospitals per patient, but the payment amount for patients classified as dangerous is 3 times higher. And in the last 4 months, the proportion of dangerous patients has increased dramatically. And this is fraud worth millions of pounds. But there's worse." Holmes pulled out another document. "I see that it's not just the government paying for some patients. Money is also coming from private sources." Watson looked at the document. "Private sources?" Holmes pointed to a name. "Victor Harlan. Do you remember that name?" Watson thought. "No, I don't." Holmes pulled out his notes. "Victor Harlan is a wealthy merchant, and he's the brother of one of the patients on the chief physician's list, Thomas Whitmore." Watson's eyes widened. "Did he have his brother committed to the hospital?" "It appears so, and Harlan makes regular donations to the hospital. But the timing of these donations is interesting. Each one follows immediately after his brother was reclassified as dangerous." Holmes stood up and began pacing the room. "The picture is becoming clear, Watson. This isn't just defrauding the state. It's also serving the interests of private individuals. Wealthy people are having relatives who are inconvenient to them locked up here. Inheritance disputes, business disagreements, family feuds. All of it is being settled behind Blackthorn's walls." Watson shook his head in disgust. "This is horrific." Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. In the hospital garden, a few patients were taking a walk. Innocent people, deprived of their freedom, victims of a fraudulent scheme. "And Bellamy is at the center of this scheme," said Holmes. "He coordinates everything. He decides which patients are admitted, which diagnoses are made, and how much each person pays." Watson came over to his friend. "What about the chief physician? Where does he come into it?" Holmes turned. The chief physician may have turned a blind eye to this scheme at first. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't want to know. But then his conscience began to weigh on him. He started investigating, learned the truth, and decided to stop it. That release list would have changed everything, Watson thought. And Bellamy killed him to stop that. Yes, the murder wasn't for revenge. It was to prevent what would happen in the future. If the chief physician hadn't died, 7 patients would have been released the next day. And those patients would have talked. Everything would have come out. Bellamy's life, his career, his freedom. It would all have ended. Holmes returned to the table and began gathering the documents. "I'm taking these. Records, Watson. They're proof of Bellamy's fraud. But we need more for the murder." Watson asked, "What kind of thing?" Holmes thought for a moment. "We need to prove Bellamy was at the hospital on the night of the murder. He said he was at home, but that's a lie. And I need to find a witness to disprove that lie." That evening, Holmes and Watson returned to the hospital to coincide with Blackthorn's night shift. Holmes wanted to speak with the night staff, particularly those who had been working on the night of the murder. Head nurse Martha Calloway had returned to the hospital despite being released. When Holmes found her in the corridor, there was gratitude on her face. "Mr. Holmes," said Calloway, "I owe you my thanks. You got me out of that cell." Holmes nodded. "Our work isn't done yet, Miss Calloway. I need to ask you a few more questions." Calloway led them to a small break room. After closing the door, Holmes began speaking. "You said you saw a shadow in the corridor around 11 o'clock on the night of the murder. A tall person walking quickly. Do you recognize this person?" Calloway thought. "I couldn't see his face, but now that I think about it, his gait seemed familiar. It resembled Bellamy's walk. He has a distinctive way of walking. Shoulders slightly hunched forward. Quick steps." Holmes looked at Watson. This was important information, but it wasn't enough on its own. "Did anyone else see him? Any of the night staff?" Calloway thought. "Thomas Garrett, one of the night watchmen. He's different from Grubb, an honest man. Maybe he saw something." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Where can I find Thomas Garrett?" "He should be on duty right now, in the watchroom next to the main entrance." Thomas Garrett was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered with a stern face. He was clearly a former soldier, as evident from his bearing. When Holmes and Watson entered the watchroom, the man stood up and greeted them. "Mr. Holmes, I've heard your name. How can I assist you?" Holmes sat down across from the man. "Mr. Garrett, were you on duty the night of the murder?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, sir, as I am every night." "Did you see anything unusual that night? Anyone?" Garrett paused for a moment. Something flickered in his eyes. Well, when the police asked, I said I didn't see anything, but..." Holmes leaned forward. "But?" Garrett took a deep breath. "I saw Mr. Bellamy around 10:30 at night. He was leaving the main building." Watson quickly jotted it down in his notebook. Holmes asked in a calm but firm voice, "Are you sure that it was Bellamy?" "Yes, sir, I saw his face, in the light of the street lamps. It was him, definitely." "Then why didn't you tell the police?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably. Because Bellamy saw me. The next day, he called me into his office. He said he wanted me to confirm that I hadn't seen him that night, that I was at home. Otherwise, I'd lose my job." Holmes looked at Watson. This was what they were looking for. Mr. Garrett, Holmes said, his voice serious, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Bellamy is a murder suspect, and you are the only honest witness who saw him at the hospital on the night of the incident. Tomorrow, you will go to Scotland Yard and give your statement, and you will tell the truth. Garrett looked hesitant, but Bellamy will be arrested soon. He won't be a threat to you. But know this, if you tell the truth now, you will be protected as a witness in court. If you lie, you could be tried as an accomplice. Garrett thought for a few seconds. Then he nodded. All right, Mr. Holmes, I'll go tomorrow, and I'll tell everything. Holmes stood up and shook the man's hand. You made the right decision, Mr. Garrett, and I know it takes courage to do that. Garrett looked at him seriously. I learned that as a soldier, sir. Sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing. As they left the hospital, Watson turned to his friend. Holmes, what do we have now? Holmes counted as he walked. First, the financial records. They prove Bellamy's fraud scheme. Second, Grubb's confession. It shows Bellamy hired a false witness to frame Calloway. Third, Garrett's statement. It proves Bellamy was at the hospital on the night of the murder. Watson thought, is that enough? Holmes paused for a moment. Almost. But there's one more thing. The kitchen key. Bellamy was the only manager who could enter the kitchen that night, and the murder weapon was taken from there. Watson nodded. It seems like a very strong case, Holmes replied as he got into the carriage. Yes, strong. But Bellamy is rich and well-connected. He'll have good lawyers. They'll try to question every piece of evidence. That's why everything has to be perfect. As the carriage rolled through the streets of London, Holmes looked out the window. Night had fallen, and the street lamps cast a yellow glow. A normal night, a normal city. But for Holmes, this night was a turning point. Watson, he said, his voice low. Tomorrow, everything will change. Bellamy will be arrested, the patients will be released, and Blackthorn's dark secrets will come to light. Watson looked at his friend's face. There were signs of fatigue, but a glimmer of victory shone in his eyes. And then, Watson asked. Holmes turned and smiled slightly. Then, Watson, we'll move on to the next case, because there is always darkness in London, and where there is darkness, there is a need for light. The carriage moved toward Baker Street. Behind them, Blackthorn's silhouette faded into the night. But tomorrow, the truth behind those walls would be revealed to all of London. Holmes touched the notes in his pocket. The chief physician's list, financial records, witness statements. All the pieces were in place. Tomorrow, Sherlock Holmes would confront Arthur Bellamy. And this confrontation would be a turning point in Blackthorn's history. The innocent would be freed, the guilty would be punished. Justice would finally be served. But tonight, Holmes just wanted to rest, because tomorrow would be a long day. Chapter 7. The Revelation of the Truth. In the early hours of the morning, leaden clouds gathered over London. The air was heavy and damp, as if even the city sensed the approaching storm. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, watching the street. Behind him, Watson sat at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper, but his mind was elsewhere. Today, Holmes said, turning around. Today, everything comes to an end, Watson. Watson looked at his friend's face. There was weariness in Holmes's eyes, but also a determination, a certainty. The hunter had cornered his prey. It was time for the final move. At 9 o'clock, Inspector Aldridge knocked on the door. 2 police officers were with him. His face wore a serious but hopeful expression. "Mr. Holmes, we're ready. The arrest warrant has been issued." Holmes nodded. "Excellent, Inspector. But first, we need to go to Blackthorn and gather everyone. I want to accuse Bellamy in front of everyone." Aldridge frowned. "Why? Can't we just arrest him directly?" Holmes explained as he put on his coat. "Because this isn't just an arrest, Inspector. This is the collapse of a system. Bellamy has partners inside and outside. If we just arrest him and take him away, the others could escape, destroy the evidence. But if we reveal the whole truth in front of everyone, no one can deny it." Watson stood up. "Holmes is right. This isn't just a murder case. This is dismantling a corruption network." Aldridge paused for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mr. Holmes. I trust your method." By the time we arrived at Blackthorn Mental Hospital, it was approaching 11 o'clock. Holmes requested that all the key figures gather in the large meeting room. Inspector Aldridge used his authority to make this request an official order. Within half an hour, the room began to fill. Arthur Bellamy sat at the head of the table trying to appear indifferent, but the anxiety behind his eyes was impossible to hide. Dr. Simon Price sat in the corner, his hands on his knees, his pale face trembling. Martha Calloway sat with an upright posture, the pride of a woman who had gained her freedom. Thomas Garrett had taken his place with military seriousness. And Victor Harlan, the wealthy merchant, surprised when invited but unable to refuse, now waited with a nervous expression. Additionally, several doctors, nurses, and administrative staff were present. All watched Holmes with curious and anxious expressions. Holmes walked to the center of the room. Watson, as always, stood beside his friend. Inspector Aldridge and his men were positioned at the doors. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Holmes, his voice echoing through the room, "I have gathered you here because I am going to reveal the truth about the murder committed within these walls a week ago. The person behind Dr. Edmund Halbrook's death and the reason for it." Bellamy interrupted with a dismissive tone. "Mr. Holmes, this is an unnecessary spectacle. The killer has already been found and released. Martha Calloway." "Mrs. Calloway is innocent," said Holmes, his voice sharp. "And everyone will know it. But first, I'll tell you how this hospital has become a center of corruption over the past 4 months. A stir went through the room. People looked at each other, whispering. Bellamy's face tensed, but he remained silent. Holmes placed a stack of files on the table. "These documents are Blackthorn's financial records, and they are evidence of systematic fraud." He explained the documents one by one: the abnormal increase in patient admissions, the dramatic rise in the dangerous classification, the disproportionate increase in government payments. Every number, every date told a story of crime. "In the last 4 months," Holmes said, 23 new patients have been admitted to this hospital. 17 of them were examined and diagnosed by the same doctor, Dr. Simon Price. All eyes turned to Price. The young doctor shrunk in his chair. Holmes continued. "For 12 of these 17 patients, the diagnosis was almost word for word the same. Severe melancholia, periodic detachment from reality, potential danger to society. This is not a medical diagnosis. It's a template, a formula." Dr. Price couldn't take it anymore. I was just following orders, he shouted. I was told to... Who told you, Dr. Price? Holmes asked, calm but authoritative. Price's eyes shifted to Bellamy. Then, in a whisper, Mr. Bellamy, he told me everything. A murmur rose in the room. Bellamy jumped to his feet. That's a lie. This man is accusing me to cover up his own crime. Holmes raised his hand to silence them. Sit down, Mr. Bellamy. I'm not finished yet. Bellamy glared at Holmes angrily for a few seconds. Then, reluctantly, he sat back down. Holmes took out a second file. This file contains Peter Grubb's confession. Mr. Grubb, the night watchman at this hospital, had claimed to have seen Mrs. Calloway in the corridor on the night of the murder. But last night, he told me the truth. He read Grubb's statement. How Bellamy had approached him, what he had said, how much money he had offered. Every word sent shockwaves across the faces of the people in the room. So, said Holmes, the only eyewitness against Mrs. Calloway was a bought-off liar. Mrs. Calloway is innocent. She always was. Calloway bowed her head, tears in her eyes. A nurse beside her squeezed her hand. Holmes took a third step forward. Now, let's get to the night of the murder. Mr. Bellamy claimed he was at home that night. But I have another witness. Mr. Thomas Garrett. Garrett stood up. His shoulders were straight, his voice strong. At 10:30 that night, I saw Mr. Bellamy leaving the main building. I saw his face clearly. It was him, definitely. Bellamy's face turned bright red. This man is lying. I was here that night. You were here that night, Mr. Bellamy, said Holmes, his voice as cold as ice. And you weren't just here. You went to the chief physician's office. You spoke with him. And then you killed him. The room fell completely silent. Everyone held their breath. Holmes took a small piece of paper out of his pocket. This note was found in the chief physician's drawer. Dr. Halbrook, we need to talk about the report you plan to present at tomorrow's meeting. I'll be in your office tonight at 9. A B, signed, A.B., Arthur Bellamy. Bellamy looked at the paper. The colour drained from his face. Holmes continued. You visited the chief physician that night because you had learned of his plan. You knew that 7 patients would be released the next day, and that would have been the end of you. Holmes began pacing the room. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of a storyteller. Dr. Halbrook had begun to suspect something in the last few weeks. He examined the new patients admitted to the hospital. He noticed patterns in the diagnoses. And most importantly, he spoke with some of these patients, people like Leonard Marsh. When Marsh's name was mentioned, the air in the room grew even heavier. Marsh was a healthy man, an accountant. His family had brought him here, but he wasn't crazy, and he had requested a meeting with the chief physician to tell the truth. Holmes paused and turned to Bellamy. But that meeting never happened, because the chief physician was murdered, and 2 days later, Leonard Marsh was also murdered. This information had the effect of a bomb in the room. People looked at each other in shock. Marsh didn't die of a heart attack, said Holmes. He was poisoned. A low dose of arsenic was mixed into his sedative. Dr. Watson and I proved it. Watson stepped forward. Blood tests showed traces of arsenic. This was not a natural death. It was murder. Holmes looked at Bellamy. You killed Marsh to silence him, because he was one of the 7 patients on the chief physician's list. And those 7 people could have exposed your entire scheme. Bellamy stood up, his face contorted with anger. All of this is speculation. You have no proof, Holmes replied calmly. I have proof, Mr. Bellamy. The murder weapon was a knife taken from the kitchen, and the kitchen was locked at night. Only 2 people had the key, the head chef and you. The head chef has an alibi. He was at home that night. But you were here. Holmes paused to play his final card. Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting. And there's one more thing, said Holmes. Mr. Victor Harlan. The wealthy merchant flinched at the mention of his name. What do I have to do with this? Holmes turned to Harlan. You had your brother Thomas Whitmore committed to this hospital. Isn't that right? Harlan's face paled. He was sick. He needed treatment. No, Mr. Harlan. Your brother wasn't sick. He was an obstacle to your inheritance from your father, and you made a deal with Bellamy. You had your brother committed here, branded as insane. In return, you made regular donations to the hospital. Holmes showed him one of the financial records. Here are the donation receipts. Each one is dated immediately after your brother was reclassified as dangerous. This isn't a treatment fee, Mr. Harlan. This is the price of complicity. Harlan collapsed in his chair. All resistance was broken. Holmes stepped back into the center of the room. This is Blackthorn's true face, not a mental hospital, but a prison, a system that locks up healthy people for money, for gain, for revenge. And at the center of this system is Arthur Bellamy. He turned to Bellamy. You created this system. You stole money from the state. You stole the freedom of innocent people. And when Dr. Halbrook tried to stop it, you killed him. Holmes raised his voice. At 10:30, Garrett saw you leaving the building, but you went to the chief physician's office first. He was waiting for you because you wrote that note. You went in, you talked, and then you went behind him because he trusted you. He was naive enough to trust you, innocent enough to turn his back on you, and you slit his throat with a knife you took from the kitchen. Bellamy was standing, holding onto the table. His face was as white as a sheet, his lips trembling. Holmes continued. Then you took his files, to destroy the evidence. But you couldn't take everything. Some documents were hidden in books, and the chief physician's list was left at the bottom of the drawer. Holmes stepped directly in front of Bellamy. You are a murderer, Mr. Bellamy, and today justice will be served. Bellamy seemed completely broken for a moment. Then suddenly he reached into his pocket. But Inspector Aldridge was quicker. 2 police officers grabbed Bellamy and twisted his arms behind his back. A small pistol came out of his pocket. Holmes compared Bellamy's fingerprint with the one he had taken from the knife earlier, and the fingerprints matched. Arthur Bellamy, Aldridge said in an official tone. You are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Edmund Halbrook and the murder of Leonard Marsh. Anything you say can be used against you in court. As Bellamy was being handcuffed, he looked at Holmes. His eyes held anger, hatred, and perhaps a hint of fear. This isn't over, Holmes, he said, his voice sounding like a hiss. There are powerful people behind me. Holmes replied calmly. He's gone, Mr. Bellamy. He's gone. After Bellamy was taken away, the room remained silent for a while. Then slowly, people began to talk. Shock, relief, anger. All emotions were mixed together. Holmes turned to Inspector Aldridge. Inspector, there are 6 more patients on the list. Initiate the necessary procedures to release them immediately. Aldridge nodded. I'll take care of it immediately, Mr. Holmes. Victor Harlan was also arrested, charged with conspiracy and fraud. Dr. Price was placed under witness protection. His testimony would be critical to Bellamy's conviction. Martha, Calloway approached Holmes. Her eyes were glistening with tears, but there was a smile on her face. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you. You got me out of jail. You restored my reputation." Holmes bowed his head politely. "You were innocent, Miss Calloway. I merely uncovered the truth. But you didn't have to do that. Many people would have chosen the easy way. You chose the right way." Holmes looked thoughtful for a moment. Sometimes the right path and the easy path are not the same. But in the end, the right path is always more valuable. That afternoon there was unusual activity in the corridors of Blackthorn. 6 patients who had been wrongly diagnosed were being prepared for release. Their families, lawyers, acquaintances, all had flocked to the hospital. As Holmes and Watson walked through the hospital garden, they saw a man approaching them. Thomas Whitmore, Victor Harlan's brother, was a man who had regained his freedom. His eyes were filled with tears, his face an expression of incredible gratitude. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice breaking, "my brother locked me up here. For 3 months within these walls, I was treated like a madman. I knew I wasn't mad, but no one believed me. No one." Holmes placed his hand on the man's shoulder. "You are free now, Mr. Whitmore, and your brother will pay for what he has done." Whitmore squeezed Holmes's hand. I owe you my life." Holmes shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just make good use of this second chance. Live your life. Enjoy your freedom. That will be the greatest thanks for me." Whitmore wiped his eyes and walked away. Other freed patients thanked Holmes with similar feelings. Each had a different story, a different tragedy. But they all had one thing in common. They were all victims of Blackthorn's dark regime. And now they were all free. Watson stood beside his friend, watching these scenes unfold. "Holmes," he said, his voice low, "did you see the expressions on these people's faces? Their happiness right now." Holmes nodded. "I see it, Watson, and it was worth all our fatigue." In the evening, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street. They sat in the sitting room in front of the fireplace. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea, then quietly left. Watson spoke thoughtfully as he sipped his tea. "Holmes, this case was different. We've solved many murders before, but this wasn't just a murder." Holmes lit his pipe and replied, "You're right, Watson. This was a system, a decay, and sometimes catching a killer isn't enough. You have to bring down the system too." Watson thought. Bellamy was confident, rich, connected, powerful. He thought he had everything figured out. Holmes smiled slightly. But he didn't think of one thing. The truth always finds a way, Watson. No matter how well you hide in the dark, the light will eventually seep through. Watson stared into the fire. Dr. Halbrook was a brave man. He knew exposing this scheme could cost him his life. But he still chose to do the right thing. Holmes took a puff from his pipe. Yes, and that courage killed him, but it also made him immortal. Because what he started, we finished. The people he wanted to protect are now free. Watson looked at his friend. "You're a brave man too, Holmes. You know that, don't you?" Holmes looked surprised for a moment. Then a rare, soft smile appeared on his face. "I'm just doing my job, Watson. I'm searching for the truth, and sometimes the truth hides in dangerous places." Watson nodded. "But you choose to go to those dangerous places. That's courage." Holmes didn't reply. He just stared at the flames in the fireplace, deep in thought. Outside, the sounds of London at night rose up. Carriages, footsteps, the melody of a street musician in the distance. A normal night, a normal city. But in the dark corners of this city, there was always crime, always injustice, always pain. And Sherlock Holmes was there to fight that darkness. Watson stood up. "Good night, Holmes. Tomorrow is a new day." Holmes nodded. "Good night, Watson, and thank you." Watson turned. "Why?" Holmes looked at his friend. "For always being by my side, for not leaving me alone on this journey." Watson smiled. "Always, Holmes. Always." As the night wore on, Holmes remained seated in his chair. His pipe had gone out, but he didn't relight it. He was just thinking. He thought of Leonard Marsh. That calm, rational man had been swallowed up by a wrong world. And now that world had collapsed. But Marsh would not return. He was one of the casualties of this war. He was thinking about Dr. Halbrook. His conscience had led him to his death. But that same conscience had saved others. Sometimes one person's sacrifice could save many. And he thought of Bellamy, a clever, cunning, ruthless man. But in the end, his own greed had destroyed him. Like every criminal, he had made a mistake. And Holmes had found that mistake. Outside, dawn was breaking. Pink and orange lights appeared over London. A new day, new beginnings. Holmes finally stood up and walked to the window. The streets were slowly coming to life. Workers, vendors, servants. Everyone was starting a new day, and somewhere 6 people emerging from Blackthorn's doors were experiencing the first morning of their freedom. They felt the sun on their faces, the clean air filling their lungs. For them, this was no ordinary morning. This was rebirth. Holmes smiled slightly. Sometimes this work wore him out. The darkness was heavy, but sometimes, as dawn broke, he felt it was all worth it. "Madness," he murmured to himself, recalling the chief physician's final words. It wasn't a disease, it was a tool. But now that tool was broken, and Holmes was proud of it. Watson's footsteps could be heard behind him. His friend had come with morning tea. "Didn't you sleep at all?" Watson asked, worried. Holmes turned. "I was thinking, but now I'm ready for breakfast." Watson smiled. "Then come. Mrs. Hudson has prepared something special for you." Holmes looked out the window one last time. London, as always, was chaotic and beautiful. Darkness and light side by side. "I'm coming, Watson," he said. "I'm coming." And at 221 B. Baker Street, a new day was beginning. The shadows of last night had dispersed. Blackthorn's darkness had ended. But in London, new shadows always emerged, and Sherlock Holmes was always ready. Because this was his work. This was his destiny. To find the truth, to seek justice, and to be the light in the darkness. The end.